So let's move on. We're in the next chapter. Whoops. This is chapter 6, interventions, and part 1. So there'll be 2 little videos on it. Maybe not so little. We'll see. So we're still in, of course, Walzer's book. And we are in part 2, the theory of aggression, as I said, chapter 6, video 1 on it. Now, we've seen that Walzer, in a previous video, he has laid out the legalist paradigm and had the 6 basic propositions. He's already made a modification to one of the propositions regarding preemptive, preventative wars, stuff like that. So have a look at a previous video for that one, just the one on basically chapter 5. And now we're going to again return to this legalist paradigm, right, LP. And here he's going to make a couple more modifications, and we'll see what that is. But what he wants to discuss here is interventions, hot topic, right? And Walzer says, you know, we should be very careful when we think about interventions because history shows that states are often quite anxious and quite ready to intervene in the affairs of their neighbors, just kind of like human beings. So a little bit nosy. So, but of course, as we recall, when in a previous video and earlier on in the book, when Walzer was talking about how states interact with each other, it's a lot different, right? When we interact as individuals, often the stakes are very small. They can be enormous, but they're not always as enormous as when states interact and they get involved with each other. Then you often have issues like force and human life put at risk. When humans interact, there's lots of interactions, even that if they're aggressive, there's nobody's life at risk. There could be other things at risk, but it's not always one's life and limb. But with states, yeah, it's why that he has that undifferentiated notion of aggression on the international level and a very heavily differentiated notion of aggression on the domestic level. So that's where the analogy breaks down. Okay, and it breaks down in a variety of places, but it does the work that it does. Okay, so now the legalist paradigm LP seems to entail a principle P, that states should never interfere in the domestic affairs of other states, right? When you think about that, that's really aggression. You're kind of crossing borders, you're getting involved, you're mucking around in the business. A state, that is you as a state, are mucking around in the business of other states. You shouldn't do that. That is basically aggression. So that seems to flow very nicely. Maybe not, maybe entails is a little too strict because that's a logical notion, but it seems to be you could derive that fairly readily to stick closer to Walzer's text. So the principle P is states, you know, stay out of the business of the internal affairs of other states. But as we've seen, that legalist paradigm is a story that has been developed over centuries. It's full of concepts and ideas that we have. And it's kind of an abstraction from them. So when we dig under sort of this abstraction from these ideas, you know, that abstraction being the legalist paradigm, if you go and you dig down, go down into the basement, you find that all these concepts and of life and liberty that underpin this, they don't readily support it. They don't readily support that principle. Because if you think, you know, in everyday life, there's places where we meddle and we think it's okay to meddle in the affairs of others, and some cases where we don't. And the same thing has an analogy up on the international, interstate level, that some of the concepts we have of life and liberty that would apply also to states don't really support the principle P. What do they support? Well, it seems that these underlying the basement there, prior to the abstraction, they support that sometimes disregarding P. In other words, well, when we look at it from this perspective under here before we make that abstraction, it seems that we'll sometimes remove that never and say, maybe you shouldn't do it, or you should do it with great caution. You could do it sometimes or whatever, but it's getting rid of the never and saying, well, sometimes it's okay, sometimes, but we got to be careful about this. It's got to be justified, and the point is that it can be justified. That's the point. All right. Well, if we look at it that way and say it can be justified, well, what are these rules? Like, how are you going to justify when you disregard P? P seems to be something that, yeah, you should really be careful of violating it. So when are you going to do it? So how do you justify interventions? Well, first off, interventions are, we're not going to just define them as criminal, right? Okay, maybe we should or maybe we shouldn't, but we don't really just automatically label them criminal. But remember, no matter what, an intervention does threaten territorial integrity and political independence. They sound like aggressive acts, right? Because you're going in there, you're crossing borders. But again, first, an intervention has to be justified. That's the first thing we're going to start off. You do that, the burden of proof is on the state that intervenes, the one that's doing the interfering, the intervening. So that's where the burden of proof is, the state that intervenes. And depending on what the intervening state is doing, notice I'm not necessarily calling it an aggressor state, but it is crossing a border. Well, when you're crossing a border, you've got a high, in virtue of the fact that you're crossing an international border, you have a high burden of proof. And it goes up, if you're using force, right? And it goes up very high if force is being used. Because it not only because of the coercions and ravages that military intervention. So if you bring the military intervention here, the burden of proof goes up, not simply because of the damage and possible loss of life and all that military intervention inevitably brings, but because it is also thought that the citizens of a sovereign state have a right, if they're going to be coerced and ravaged at all, to suffer only at the hands of each other, right? So it sounds a little bit odd, but it's, if I'm going to be, Walzer's basically saying that I seem to have more of a right against being interfered in my life by, more of a right against that vis-a-vis other states than the members of my own state. A little bit odd, but I think if you think it through, it's like, yeah, if something's going to interfere in my life, it's going to be my fellow citizens rather than citizens of another country. I think we would be more comfortable with that. Think about it in the sense of, if people are going to pass policies and interfere in your life, you're going to be a lot more comfortable. You may not be perfectly comfortable. That's not the point. The point is you would be more comfortable, even much more, if it's your fellow citizens doing it to you rather than non-citizens of another country, or not your fellow citizens. That's Walzer's point there. All right. So now we've got here, when we think about interventions, again, we have our analogy with individuals and states, right? So we've seen this analogy before, the state and the individual. And it seems like when we look and think about, and he brings up Mill, right? The John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century British philosopher, talking about freedom. So let's talk about the idea of freedom for an individual. Now, freedom, of course, is a complex term. It can be defined in different ways. Freedom to, freedom from. What exactly do you mean? Freedom of the will, freedom, political freedom, etc., etc. But think of it this way. How you define the notion of freedom for an individual is going to affect the route, the pathway to that freedom, right? Now, Mill, it seems to be in the notion of true freedom, right, really can be achieved by an individual, only achieved, I should put a little only, or achieved only by an individual for him or herself, right? So you can't really say, yeah, I was, someone else made me free, right? You can only really become free yourself. So yes, sure, you could have others help you be free by removing external constraints, but really in the end, the true freedom of an individual, ultimately in kind of this Millsian sense, is only something that the individual can ultimately achieve for him or herself, or themselves, however you want to phrase that. But right, this is a process, and it's not that everyone can do it. So here's a simple kind of exception: is this is not going to be for children, it's going to be something that, the true freedom is for rational beings like adults, right? They can come and make themselves free, but children really can't. So that's why you're not really doing something immoral, but through parenting, if you block a child from doing something like that, you're actually helping them be, you can be paternalistic to a child, and it's not immoral because you know best. But for rational beings and adults, it's not acceptable if you just do stuff for them and that's against what they want, just simply because you know better. That's a paternalism, and Mills thinks that's a bad thing. People won't become free if they're treated in a paternalist fashion, if they're truly rational beings. But he even has a little exception on that. So the principle of self-determination, really a state has to make itself free. That doesn't, so it has to have that sovereignty, this freedom from intervention in order to become free. So Mill doesn't really think that imposed freedoms or that freedom can come from without. Basically, states, if they're going to be free, they may never get there or whatever, but if they're really going to become free, they have to basically become free on their own. But there are some collectivities that he thinks don't really merit this principle of self-determination. But again, Mill is sort of against the external imposition of freedom. Sometimes it's phrased in this way: it can't be external, it's got to be organic, it's got to grow up in the state. But again, we can think of it as an analogy here. Like, when does a child become an adult? Like, when does the individual sort of make the move or progress beyond can be the object of legitimate paternalism to can no longer be the object of legitimate paternalism? The same thing, and Mill here is a very 19th century guy. Marx is in line with this too. He held a similar view that some collectivities don't really meet the threshold here, that they're not going to meet the threshold of embodying this principle of self-determination. At least certain times. So Mill thinks that, there would be certain groups of humans, certain collectivities that wouldn't really qualify for this principle of independence. They lack some kind of competence. And so in that case, an outsider state can legitimately make decisions in their best interest. And yes, that's often used to justify, British expansion and colonialism and things like that. So this idea that certain groups of peoples were not ready for self-government and things along that line. So Mill does that. You can find places where Marx talks like that. And certainly it's, absolutely a completely debatable question on that one. But that was the thinking of the time, that there was largely this notion of how things progressed in certain ways, societies progressed in certain ways, and so they had certain stages. So there was this grand sort of theory of the way societies moved, and it was again very analogous to the way an individual grows up. So societies grow up in a similar way as individuals. Very common in the 19th century, but of course an extremely dubious thesis. But again, it's important to understand where these authors are thinking. Okay, so but again, Walzer is to get back to Walzer is, well, okay, so if we have the legalist paradigm that gives this, very clear thing, P, don't ever intervene, but deeper down we have this, you can seem to sort of get this from a little bit from Mill, but what are we going to do here? Like, it seems that we can sometimes support disregarding this principle. And now, what are the rules? So how are we going to really fit this all together? In what way are we going to say that under some circumstances or certain situations, maybe it is okay to have an intervention? Well, that's a complex one. And we'll see in the next video a couple of examples that Walzer talks about, and that will lead us to, well, no surprise, a couple more modifications of the legalist paradigm. See you next video.